the first class, I discussed the points of departure of the programmatic argument, the argument about alternatives that I propose for this course. The method, the way of thinking about structural alternatives, the normative ideal, and the content as defined by contrast to the default position of the progressives in the world today, institutionally conservative social democracy. In this class, I want to address the problem of the dictatorship of no alternatives in the American context. And in the next class, in the context of European social democracy. And my plan today is to proceed in 3 large steps. In the first step, I want to take as my point of departure an interpretation of what I'm going to call the message of the American prophets. The characteristic form of that revolutionary ideal on both the political and the personalist side, to which I alluded last week. Then in the second part of my remarks, I want to address certain turning points in American history, insofar as they can shed light on our programmatic concerns. The nature of the structural alternatives that would be needed, and the way in which the imperative of structural change and structural vision has been evaded and continues to be evaded in the United States. And in the third part of my remarks, I then want to sketch against this historical and interpretive background a view of the main elements of an alternative progressive program in the American context. Now, that view will be very schematic, very summary, because each of its component features will be taken up again in the second part of the course, when we address separately the democratization of the market, the formation of the capable individual, especially through education, and the deepening of democracy, the creation of a high-energy democracy. Now, every claim that I'm going to make today is controversial. It is not only disputable, but disputed. And although I will stop from time to time in the course of my argument to invite your comments, you shouldn't wait. If you want to intervene immediately while I'm speaking, just raise your hand and I'll stop at a convenient moment. So first, the message of the American prophets. By the American prophets, I mean figures such as Emerson, Whitman, and Lincoln in the early and mid-19th century, who formulated the characteristic American vision. And that vision you will immediately recognize as a variant of the revolutionary program that I invoked last week. The program that remains the strongest agenda in the world because it commands the agenda, but that is at the same time as strong, now weak, because its adepts no longer know what its next step should be. The core of the message of the American prophets is the idea of the transcendence of the self, of the individual agent over circumstance, a fundamental idea of humanity, that there is more in us, in each of us individually, and in all of us collectively, the human race, than there is or ever can be in the social and conceptual worlds that we build and inhabit. They are finite in relation to us, these worlds, and we are infinite in relation to them. We always have more potential of experience, of vision, of connection, of invention than these established regimes of society or of thought can countenance. We have a quality of excess and the power of transgression. And this is the quality which in the old theological language of the West we call spirit. So on this view, the individual becomes more human by becoming more godlike. And by increasing his share in the divine attribute of transcendence, rather than falsely seeking to emulate the divine attributes of omniscience and omnipotence. This is the core of the message of the American prophets. And therefore, in this prophetic message, the attempt is to establish and develop a form of national life organized in institutions and practices that can do justice to this idea of who we really are and can become. Now, this idea formulated by the secular prophets whom I just mentioned is also connected to the most distinctive trait of religion in American history. You can distinguish three elements in the religious experience of the American people. One element is provided by the organized and ancient forms of Christianity, the established churches, the long history. The second element is the secular humanism, which often gives a secular form, compromised, accommodated to the established culture and arrangements of these moral and religious ideas. But the third element is what Harold Bloom called the American Gnostic religion. And it is the distinctive element, the distinctive American contribution to the religious history of humanity. And it is represented by religious movements such as the Latter-day Saints or Seventh-day Adventism or Jehovah's Witnesses. It is the religious radicalization of that idea of the divinity of the ordinary man and woman, then taken as the basis, the religious basis for the democratic conception, that there is a communion and exchange of natures. And in the previous history of Christianity, if it resembles anything, it resembles the Orthodox Christianity of the East with its emphasis on the exchange or the communication of the human and divine natures. As the Orthodox theologian Maximus the Confessor said, God becomes man by condescension, and man becomes God by grace. There is an exchange of the human and divine natures. Now, what I want to say, dogmatically, just to define a point of view, is that it is not enough to claim, as many have claimed, that this prophetic message in the United States, as elsewhere, has failed to be enacted, or has been enacted only in a way that betrays it, that betrays its promise. It is necessary to criticize the prophetic message, the message of the American prophets, as it was formulated in its original form, and to criticize it both in its secular and its religious manifestations. Now, in many different respects, the United States, when compared to the other advanced societies of the North Atlantic world, is an outlier. And it is one of the remarkable features of the contemporary situation that the predominant power for so long has been an outlier. And one of the many dimensions on which it is an outlier is that it remains a very religious country. Paradoxically, in the United States, there remains an inhibition on the political expression of religious views, the overt allusion to religious faith as a basis for ideas about society and its future. And more than that, there is in the United States, as in much of the world, a taboo against the religious criticism of religions. So it is considered unacceptable in the United States to attack another religion on the basis of religious faith. For example, one version of Christianity from the standpoint of another. And evidently, this taboo against the religious criticism of religion cannot be accepted. It is unacceptable, or it should be unacceptable, both to someone who has religious faith and to a Democrat. It must be unacceptable to the believer, because one of the essential attributes of the world religions is their impulse to penetrate the whole of experience, not to be cabined in the individual conscience, not to accept a privatization of the sublime. And it should be unacceptable to a Democrat, because how could we wall off one of the most important, or the most important, inspiration of our ideas about humanity and what it can and should become? So in the spirit of keeping open the frontier between religious consciousness and political commitments, I then want to state a view of the two major taints on the message of the American prophets. The premise is that it's not just that the message has not been fulfilled, is that there was something wrong with the formulation of the message from the outset. The first taint on the message of the American prophets is that it contains, and this is very characteristic of the predominant forms of consciousness and culture in the United States, an inadequate view and a flawed view of the relation between self-construction and solidarity. So on this view, the individual by his own efforts, raises himself up, and then becoming stronger, he is generous, he cooperates with others, he helps lift others up as well. But the view is that the solidaristic commitment is separate from the self-construction. The individual builds himself. He, again, is like the little Napoleon who crowns himself. And this seems to be a false view of the nature of self-construction. No one builds himself. So one of the fundamental conditions of self-assertion is that we have to connect. And the problem is that every connection threatens us with subjugation or loss of personal distinction. And therefore we can be free, we can build ourselves only if we are somehow able to connect without paying this price of subjugation or loss of individual distinction. And we have an experience of such a form of reconciliation that is internal to our struggle for self-construction in personal love. But outside the sphere of intimacy where love flourishes, we need something else. And something else is then cooperation among free and equal individuals, the institutional form of which is always indeterminate and therefore the object of struggle, intellectual struggle and practical political struggle. Now, the second taint on the message of the American prophets is what you could label institutional idolatry, using a religious term. It's the idea that there is a definitive form of the free society, a definitive institutional form, that is the natural and necessary background to this ascent of the individual, to the increase of our quota in the divine attribute of transcendence. And this institutional idolatry is most acutely manifest in the United States in the cult of the Constitution, which is part of the national identity, but also pervasively expressed in the tendency to naturalize the private order. For example, in the belief that the market economy, the market system, has a single natural and necessary form. Now, this institutional idolatry, at the limit, takes the form that we recurrently see in the development of American ideas, the belief, to exaggerate, in the United States, that the Republic discovered at the time of its foundation the definitive form of a free society. And this form has only to be adjusted from time to time under the provocation of crisis, but not fundamentally altered ever. And the rest of humanity must either then subscribe to this form, submit to this form, if it too is to be free, or else continue to suffer the burdens of poverty and despotism. Now, belief should be unacceptable, both to a Democrat and to the Christians, to a Christian, because it is a displacement onto the institutional order, which is always flawed and contingent, of absolute value and reality, which it cannot deserve or sustain. So that's just by way of a preliminary to my historical and programmatic argument, and just to establish a point of view, which the message of the American prophets gives an orientation, but the orientation is subject to dispute. And this is like a cloud of not only of danger, but of moral and political possibility overshadowing the historical conflicts. Now, let me stop there because that's meant to be just a preliminary, but I think a very momentous set of circumstances for someone who engages the American experience sympathetically but critically. It's not enough to criticize the failure to enact the prophetic message. It's also necessary to criticize the prophetic message itself in its canonical formulation. And of course, then the premise of that critical activity is that in the religious history of humanity and under democracy, the gates of prophecy are always open. And the prophetic message is not uttered once and for all, but must continue to be formulated. And there must be prophets who attack other prophets for us to go forward. And furthermore, we must believe as Democrats that prophetic powers are widely diffused in the whole of humanity, rather than restricted to a tiny enclosed spiritual elite. Well, that's only what I wanted to say by way of this introductory part of my remarks. And I'm open to your comments. Yes?
Could the message of the American prophets, as you've described them, or the modern day believers in the Constitution, or
Yes.
whatever, be described not as a message of the American system as the ideal, but as a good enough, accepting that perhaps some ideal system is unattainable?
Sure. So let's think about the view of the self of humanity that underlies this second criticism, the criticism of institutional idolatry. Because when I stated the first criticism, I stated a background philosophical view that we become free only through connection. Connection is dangerous. We have to diminish the price of subjugation. Now, there's an equivalent philosophical problem lying in the background of the second criticism, the criticism of institutional idolatry. We must engage in a particular order in order to be free. No one develops himself in the wilderness without engagement in a particular social and cultural world. However, every engagement seems to exact from us as the price of engagement that we surrender to the world in which we're engaging. And to be free on this view, we must not have to choose between disengagement or marginalization and engagement with surrender. We must be able to engage without surrendering so that we can participate in a particular world, but deny it the last word and keep the last word to ourselves. So in other words, to change the vocabulary, that we can be insiders and outsiders at the same time. And then we have to ask of the institutions, because they're always contingent and flawed, to what extent, instead of entrenching themselves against challenge and change, they facilitate and organize their own transformation in the light of experience. And that then leads beyond institutional idolatry against institutional idolatry, because we then think there is no definitive form of the free society. All the forms that exist in history are contingent and flawed. Some forms are better than others. And moreover, contrary to the key premise of classical liberal political theory, there is no institutional order that is neutral among visions of the good, because as I claimed last week, every institutional order tilts the scales in favor of some forms of experience and against others. So this claim of neutrality always serves the opposite, that is, to entrench a particular order against criticism and attack, claiming that it is impartial. But the false ideal of neutrality nevertheless has a kinship to a legitimate and indispensable ideal, which is that the order be open, that it be full of contradiction and variety, and that it be corrigible, that we be able to challenge and change it. And that then takes us in a direction, the direction of experimentalism, which is fundamentally different on this view from the direction of institutional idolatry. So that's a way of developing this idea of the correction of the second taint on the prophetic message. And I say all of this just to make clear the relation between these very general political and spiritual ideals and the detailed historical and programmatic arguments that come next. So the whole of American history is enveloped in these ideals, in this prophetic message. And there's no absolute wall between politics and religion or spiritual life. And if we don't understand this connection, we are being shallow and truncated in our engagement with the national experience. So that's the spirit in which I made these remarks. And of course, again, we're going to come back to all of this in different forms. So I don't know whether you want to discuss this further now, or whether it's better to go ahead now to the historical discussion. Yes.
I'm going to oversimplify my takeaway from the 2 points you raised. Like, the first one was that basically maybe the American society is individualistic. The second one is that there is maybe this idolatry of authority. Like, these two, I agree that we have several problems. But don't you think that at the time the U.S. was becoming like a country, independent country?
Yes.
And maybe even for like a lot of like countries in the Americas.
Yes.
You don't have like our population, our societies are not homogeneous. They come from all parts of the world. Isn't that maybe a second best ideas or principles that could be some sort of like bonding glue of the people like in those countries? Like, I agree that they are far from ideal, but they are.
Well, the question is whether there is a misrepresentation of the true relation between self-construction and solidarity. So is solidarity internal to self-construction, or is solidarity something that comes afterward as an afterthought, enabled and empowered by self-construction? That is a very abstract question, but it has a whole range of momentous practical consequences. So that's the ideal. Now, of course, this prophetic message, every aspect of it was influenced by the practical circumstance of the Americans in the first half of the 19th century. So, for example, When Tocqueville visited the United States in the 1830s, although a large part of the population was enslaved, African slavery, among white men, only 1 in every 5 white men worked for another white man. Now, this is an extraordinary statistic because you see that basically among the free, the vast majority of the population consisted in smallholders, independent proprietors, independent tradespeople, rather than in wage laborers, as would happen later in the 19th century. So then you could say that against that practical background of political economy, it was, so to speak, natural for the Americans to have this idea of self-construction as something that was separate from solidarity. But the idea has survived its initial historical setting, and it retains its potency for better and for worse later. So we have to engage it. So, and of course, Tocqueville, the same Tocqueville to whom I just referred, makes the remark that every profound transformation is both political and religious. So by political, he means institutional, and by religious, he means having to do with consciousness. And so it's a superficial, it's a truncated engagement with a national experience, not to take these ideals seriously and to have a view. Now, the most powerful view in the United States was the view formulated by these American prophets. Their message continues to resonate. And the general posture in the United States is there's nothing wrong with their message. It's just that it hasn't been enacted. And I, of course, in these initial remarks, am taking the position out of respect for the prophetic activity and its content, that there was something wrong with their message. And that it's not just the institutions that should not be fossilized. The prophetic messages should also not be fossilized. And they too become the subject of contest and of transformation. That's the spirit. Yes?
Do you think that if it's necessary to criticize the prophetic story, is it also then necessary to espouse an alternative origin story to the extent that?
Mean a corrected form of the prophetic message?
Yeah.
Well, that's already implicit in this criticism, right? So without further development, because that would take us in the direction now of a philosophical argument about the ideal, that this conception of the transcendence of the human being remains central to the future of democracy and of experimentalism, to all the things that the progressives would have reason to propose. But it then matters that we have the right understanding of this ideal and that we free it from its taints, from its flaws. It's not just the institutions that are flawed, the prophets are also flawed. And therefore, the object of transformation has to be more general than just narrowly political. So it's a more ambitious conception of politics. So when Emerson, for example, in the mid-19th century was engaged in his activity, which we could call a prophetic activity, he was crossing the boundaries between politics and religion. He was dealing with the American situation, but he was also a critic of the established forms of Christianity and formulating a message. And in any profound process of national transformation, the ideals or the form of consciousness cannot be held constant. They too must be the subject of contest. And that's a much larger view of the ambitions of transformation. Yes?
Was building on this question.
Yes.
Part of prophecy is saying where we're going, but it's also saying who we are and where we've been.
Yes.
And part of the question is the extent to which we can criticize previous prophecies and create new prophecies without changing the narrative story of America. So, as you had commented last week, the dogmatic attachment to the Constitution and the story
Yes.
and the myth about it.
Yes.
So, to what extent to create and criticize new prophecies do we need to change?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
How do
So,
we do that well?
well, so we can only learn how to do that by doing it, in practice. And in a sense, what I'm trying to do here in this argument is meant to be an example of that. So it's not just that the arguments about institutions or alternative institutions, in some sense, depend on spiritual presuppositions, is that the argument about the spiritual presuppositions is also dependent, connected with the institutional argument.
I get that, maybe this turns into a question of tactics, but if we're trying to,
No, but it's not a question of tactics. It's a question about the scope of the struggle about
here's why I think
transformation.
it's a question about tactics, and we can't separate them.
Yes.
If we're trying to create these new prophecies, we're inevitably indicting someone's conception of their identity, because the stories about the past are
Yeah.
American, what it means to be American. And anytime we're going to indict someone's conception of their own identity, that's a tactical question about, and that's a real constraint, or at least a barrier to prophecy.
Well, so if, for example, the cult of the Constitution, as you mentioned, becomes a part of the national identity, can we just accept that as a given? I think that the experimentalist, the Democrat, the radical, the progressive cannot accept that.
Just to clarify, I'm not advocating accepting, I'm just trying to better.
No, I understand. So, but it is legitimate then, and in fact necessary, to ask what you might call the tactical question of where you begin. So, for example, if you take the cult of the Constitution, some parts of it are more amenable to change than others. So the basic constitutional setup, the Madisonian scheme of checks and balances, might be regarded as the least amenable to transformation. But the organization and experience of American federalism, for example, which is also part of the setup of the Constitution, might be regarded as more amenable to transformation because there's a widespread appeal in the United States of the re-energizing and reshaping of American federalism. It goes beyond the left, it's appealing to the right. There's a whole historical background about states' rights and the federal system as a machine of experimentation. So even though you challenge something that may be very important to the national identity, in the enactment of this challenge, you can and you must distinguish what is more accessible and what is the terrain of this engagement. But I don't think that a Democrat, or for that matter, a Christian, could accept the idea that someone's fundamental identity can be mixed up with a particular organization of social life, because that's the very fact of institutional idolatry. We transcend. There's no institutional form that deserves our definitive commitment. So let me, with respect to that, distinguish two opposing ideas, both of which I would want to argue are unacceptable or should be unacceptable, both to the Democrat and to the believer. So one form, let's call it the Hegelian heresy, is the belief that there's some set of institutions which is the end of history and which is the definitive institutional home of the free and transcendent agent. There can't be. If we're Democrats and experimentalists, we believe that all the arrangements are ephemeral, and if we're believers, we think this is all dust in the face of God. There's no definitive home. The opposing perversion from the standpoint of democracy and of belief is the romantic idea. So the romantic idea is you can shake the structures temporarily, and then those interludes in which the weight of the structures is lifted of the institutions are the interludes of authentic human experience. So, romantic love as opposed to the routines of married life, or the crowd in the streets as opposed to the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. So on this idea, the romantic idea, we might call it the existentialist idea, we're only truly ourselves, we're only truly human in those intervals in which we've shaken the structures. But the structures will always come back. So it's like Mao saying we'll have a cultural revolution. I know that the bureaucracy will come back, but this will be a moment of pure freedom and invention. So it's a kind of despair. And what it despairs of is the possibility of changing the relation between the agent and the structures. And you might say that's also a perversion. That's the opposing perversion, because it's not just that we can put some institutions in the place of other institutions. We can change the character of institutions, their relation to the institution-defying freedom of the human agent. We can create institutions that facilitate their own revision and that allow us to a greater extent to be both insiders and outsiders. So this is, of course, all very abstract and philosophical, but what I'm trying to say is that an ambitious program of transformation, as the Americans had in the early 19th century, is never just a project about institutions. It's always also a project about consciousness and about the best formulation of these opposing spiritual ideals. Now, yes?
I was just going to ask you, because you mentioned some of the American prophets.
Yes.
That in this, I can identify also a selection, a historical point in which you say these are the thinkers or the...
Who gave the canonical formulation
That's
of
right.
this dominant American
But
vision.
this is also discretionary. You can select other
Of course.
political figures and create a different political tradition and claim that the real nature of American institutions is different.
Of course. So it's true. I'm making a substantive claim that these have had canonical influence. There have been other prophets, if you like, say Melville, who had a much darker view of human possibility in the United States. And so a more textured history of sensibility would trace the dialectic between what I'm saying, the dominant message, and a series of oppositions to it.
So my question was, couldn't you choose or changing your canonic establishment
Yes.
also open a space?
Well, of course. So all of these beliefs have had enemies in the United States. So take the institutional idolatry. There's a long line of American thinkers from Thomas Jefferson to John Dewey, who opposed institutional idolatry. They were just as Americans as the ones who subscribed to it. Question of identity. No one would deny to John Dewey or Thomas Jefferson that they were part of the national experience. But they tried to persuade their fellow citizens to lift the exemption from the experimentalist impulse accorded to the institutions. So one of the characteristics of American culture is a pervasive experimentalism, but there's an exception given to the institutions. The institutions, the basic institutional structure, especially the Constitution, and to a lesser extent of the private order, the market order, is sacrosanct and beyond experimentation. And so this long line of American thinkers tried to say, this is no good. And so there was always a dialectic against this canonical message and this taint. So for example, Thomas Jefferson believed that every 2 or 3 generations, the Americans should discard their Constitution and write a completely different one. And this view was, of course, shocking to the Americans because Thomas Jefferson is one of the so-called founders. But he recommended unequivocally the periodic abolition of the Constitution because, and his fundamental argument is that the dead shouldn't govern the living. And so he established some convoluted calculus of how many years had to pass by so that the majority of the people who formed the Constitution would still be alive and not have this situation in which they would rule the others from the grave. And John Dewey, a very characteristic American thinker, proposed a radical institutional experimentalism. But what happened in the United States, to make a long story very short, is that these opponents of the institutional idolatry, on the whole, failed to persuade their fellow citizens to lift the exemption accorded to the institutions against the experimentalist impulse. So the canonical message continued to be canonical. But as you suggest, there was a struggle going way back to the very beginning of American history. So there was always a struggle about the content of this prophetic message. And my criticisms just now should be read against the background of that historical struggle. Yes?
I'm just going through the different layers of the argument because
Yes.
to challenge the institutional idolatry,
Yes.
the cult of the Constitution and others,
Yes.
we have to unpack the American myth. And the American myth comes from the prophets. But if you go a layer deeper, then for me that's all founded on
You're
this
calling it a myth. I called it a message. Yes.
language.
Yes.
No,
It matters.
I'll stick
Yes.
with myth for now. But if we go a level deeper, then that to me is founded on this American exceptionist sense of self. A sense of self which is I am because I am, or I am because I choose to be free, or I am despite
Yes.
others. But there's also other notions of self in other parts of the world which are based on I am because of others, or I am for
Yes,
others.
of course.
So
Of course.
do you give equal importance to each of these different aspects? The
Well-
institutional idolatry, the American, let's go with the prophets, and the sense of self, or is there a beginning
Yeah.
point to start unraveling these different strands?
Well, so let me say this, again, this would be a very long argument. So I wouldn't want this criticism of the message of the American prophets to be interpreted as implying that I think that in other parts of the world, the prophetic message is correctly formulated, but without taint. because the historical experience is that this kind of thing is what happens always and everywhere. So it's just that the taints are different. They're not these taints, there are other taints. So, and it's that the prophetic message is shaped by its historical context, and the taints take a different form in these different nations. And then the interest of humanity is that this dialectic continue among the different versions of the message, within the countries, about the taints of the message, and so forth. So it's not as if only the Americans, because of their belief in their special vocation, suffered such taints. They suffered these. But the situation in the world is like the one described at the beginning of Anna Karenina by Tolstoy. Every happy family is alike, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Now, there's no happy family in the nations of the world. They're just unhappy families in their different ways, and each have these taints. So it's not as if we're establishing some kind of ranking of the tainted and the untainted, because on this view, we're all tainted. And the question is just in different ways. And we progress by criticizing these taints and overcoming them. Then we fall into another set of taints, and another struggle begins, and we go forward. That's the background view to which I'm appealing. But as we do this, we begin to revise our background ideas about humanity. I just gave a little example of the attempt to do that in my comments, first about the relation between self and others, and then about the relation between the self and a particular social world. Now let me proceed to the second part of my remarks, which is most of what I had intended to discuss today, and that is the enactment of this ideal of freedom, of self-construction in historical reality, and particularly by the progressives, by the self-described or would-be progressive forces in American history. So there have been two main traditions of progressive reform in American history. One tradition has been the defense of the little guy against the big guy, small business against big business, the independent proprietor or smallholder against the accumulation of capital and economic power. And we see that, once again, from Jefferson to Brandeis. It's one power, and then going through the late 19th century agrarian populace. It's one version of the progressive reformist tradition in American history. The second major reformist tradition, especially associated with the progressive movement of the early 19th century and the first Roosevelt, and then with the second Roosevelt in the mid-20th century, accepted the formation of large corporations and accumulation of power, of economic power, but then was committed to subject that economic power to strong regulation by the central government. And neither of these two progressive traditions is adequate, I'm going to want to argue later, to addressing the major structural problems of the contemporary United States, or of any contemporary advanced society. They have something in common, these two progressive traditions. What they have in common is they accept, to a very large extent, the basic institutional arrangements of the market order as it exists and of democracy as it exists. So there are three things you can do with the market order. You can regulate it. That's one thing. You can attenuate its inequalities after the fact through retrospective and compensatory redistribution by progressive taxation and redistributive social spending. And then there's a third thing, which is much more important than those two things, which is you can change the market order. You can innovate in its legal and institutional architecture. And in this way, you can influence the primary distribution of economic advantage and opportunity, rather than trying to correct after the fact the inequalities generated in the market order. So these two reform traditions can be criticized for not doing that third thing. Now, in order to see what could be the alternative to what these two reform traditions proposed and to their way of thinking, one recourse we have historically is to think back to the elements in American history and the formation of the country that exhibited a larger range of possibilities, denied by these two reform traditions. And for that purpose, then I want to focus on the building of the country in the first half of the 19th century, in the period between independence and the Civil War. So there were two elements that seemed to be crucial. On top, there was a mobilization of national resources, physical, economic, financial, and human, to build the country. And that was the project of the ideologist and organizer of national development in the United States, Alexander Hamilton. And the American presidents in the first half of the 19th century regarded themselves as disciples of Hamilton. So it was literally building the country physically, opening it up. Using the national debt and the national bank, the first and second national banks of the United States, as the financial basis of this mobilizational project to coordinate it, and then organizing a clique, a coterie of politicians, bureaucrats, diplomats, entrepreneurs, adventurers, who were the national elite forming this project. Now, that Hamiltonian project would not have achieved its effect in helping to develop the country if it had failed to interact with a second element. And the second element was the selective democratization of the market order, despite the fearsome burden of African slavery, in what were the two crucial sectors of production at that time, the two crucial parts of the economy, agriculture and finance. So there was a broadening of access to productive resources and opportunities in those sectors. So take the example of agriculture. The Americans rejected the English path of agrarian concentration, the formation of large landholdings, the emptying out of the countryside, the workers go to the city and later on become industrial workers. They distributed the land on the agricultural frontier. And they organized the institutional and educational basis for family-scale agriculture with entrepreneurial characteristics. And this was a very complicated and ambitious endeavor. So family-scale agriculture suffers from a unique susceptibility to the combination of climate risk with price risk, physical volatility and economic volatility. And we know from comparative experience that it only survives when there is a set of safeguards against these risks. So the Americans organized a system of agricultural extension to guide the family farmer and give him access to the most advanced practice and technology of the day. They established the land-grant colleges as the cognitive or educational basis, the scientific basis of agriculture. They organized a system of food stockpiles and price supports and agricultural insurance. And all of this gave content to the idea that today we would describe as decentralized strategic coordination between the government, national or local, and the local producer, the family farmer. And then among the family farmers, they developed a regime that in today's vocabulary we would call cooperative competition. So they competed against one another, but they also shared physical resources and even labor, working on one another's land, for example. And by this device, they achieved economies of scale. So this was a remarkable adventure. And it produced the most efficient system of agriculture that had ever existed in the world up to that moment. Through the development, the educational and institutional or legal development of a kind of agricultural market that didn't exist before. It was an invention. And an invention which democratized opportunities and capabilities. Now, in finance, the other important sector, there was a struggle over the national bank, which became an instrument of the nascent financial plutocracy in the United States. And it culminated under the presidency of Andrew Jackson in the dissolution of the Second Bank of the United States and in the prohibition for over a century of interstate banking. So the Americans then proceeded to organize the most decentralized system of credit at the disposal of the local producer that had ever existed in the world. Now, this was once again, both these initiatives in agriculture and in finance, they were not the regulation of the market, nor were they redistributive compensation for inequalities generated in the market. They were the reinvention of the market, its reshaping of the market, the creation of a kind of market that didn't exist before then. What I just described a moment ago as the most important activity with respect to the market order. So one way to understand the basic dynamic of nation building in the United States in the first half of the 19th century is that it was the product of this virtuous combination of a mobilizational project on top, sustained by the central state, and of this selective democratization below in the two most important sectors of agriculture and finance, opening up access to productive resources and opportunities. And that built the United States. And now, that dynamic then is not understood and reproduced by those two reform traditions, because the dynamic was an innovation in the structures, precisely what those two reform traditions ceased to propose. Now, you could say there was also a third element, and the third element was the creation of a shield, a military shield against foreign power, a commercial shield of selective protectionism and restraints on capital flows, and a fiscal shield, the creation of a surplus of saving that allowed the state not to be on its knees before the nascent capital markets, and to be able to be bold in crafting a national development project. So you could say from this perspective that the dynamic of what lies outside those two reform traditions is already implicit in American historical experience and not captured or mobilized by those two inadequate reform traditions. Now, later in American history, this virtuous cycle, this combination of mobilization on top and democratization below, became progressively weaker. Why did it become weaker? Why was it not sustained? And then you could say, one view would be, it was not sustained because of the crucial depressing influence of two forces. One force was political, and the other force was doctrinal, conceptual. So the political force was the weakness of democracy. Democracy weak, especially in face of money, of the accumulation of economic power. Because the system organized in the United States at the end of the 18th century was not really a democracy. It was what you could call a proto-democratic liberalism. It was a democracy that filtered out popular influence and favored the government of the country by a cadre of notables. So many intermediate levels of representation. There are still vestiges in the Electoral College and in the Senate, although other forms, such as the property qualification on the suffrage, have since been abolished. A weak democracy that maintained the people at a low level of organized engagement in public life, and that adopted constitutional arrangements designed to perpetuate impasse between the political branches of government rather than to resolve impasse quickly. So it's the idea that in the American constitutional design, there is a liberal principle of the fragmentation of power and a conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. And these two principles are mixed up, combined. Not because they're necessarily combined, but because there was the intention to combine them and to inhibit the use of politics to transform the fundamentals of the private order. And then, even with respect to the third element of the organization of democratic politics, the federal system, the experimentalist potential of the federal regime was contained, because it has the potential to combine strong central initiative with radical devolution. In other words, the central government goes down a certain path, but under certain conditions, parts of the country could secede from the dominant solutions and develop a counter model of the national future. So all of these alternatives together would begin to raise the temperature and heighten the pace of democratic politics. That's not what the Americans chose. They chose what you could describe as a low-energy democracy. And the weakness of democracy was then especially its weakness later on in the 19th century with respect to money and corporate power. So the political arrangement was such that there could be fundamental change only if there was crisis. And crisis in two main forms: economic collapse and war. So Franklin Roosevelt, the major reformer of the mid-20th century, had as his allies the greatest economic calamity in modern history and the greatest war. And nevertheless, he had trouble because the system was designed to give him trouble. Now, there's a second force that inhibited the pursuit of that virtuous cycle, and the second force was intellectual or doctrinal, was the naturalization of the private order. So in its economic manifestation, it's the idea that the market economy has a single natural and necessary form, a particular regime of contract and property and corporate law, which are the natural and singular form of a market system, as opposed to the idea which the jurists defended in the evolution of legal thought from the middle of the 19th century to the end of the 20th, that a market order has no single natural and necessary form. And to this day, this idea of the naturalization of the order continues to penetrate the conventional disciplines, such as economics, and the established policy discourse. So to this day, the practical economist continues to believe that a market is a market, contract is contract, and property is property. The jurist knows that it isn't so, and that there's no natural form of contract and property. But the central belief remains the same. So I think that to my mind, the most important factors in understanding the weakening of that dialectic between mobilization on top and democratization below is this combination of the fragility of democracy and of the illusions of thought. And they collaborated to produce what you could describe as a straitjacket. Now, yes?
I was wondering, what do you think is the role of physical space in all of this? The fact that, I was asking myself, why did people not heed Thomas Jefferson's call for rebelliousness? Could it be that a lot of people who would be disposed to be rebellious would just put that energy into moving west, where you're kind of, free from all these things?
Well, first of all, I think it goes too far to call it rebelliousness. He was proposing that the Constitution, not in the formation of which he had collaborated, not be fetishized, and that you get rid of it periodically. So that didn't happen in the United States. Napoleon Bonaparte remarked that a constitution should be brief and obscure, but the only country that followed his advice was the United States. And the Americans then developed this practice of changing their constitution, mainly, not by changing it, but by pretending that it meant something different. And so this establishes a bias in the American legal and political imagination against structural change. Because you can pretend that the Equal Protection Clause or due process means something different. But how can you pretend that when the Constitution says there are 3 branches of government, it really means that there should be 5 branches of government? So it's very hard to apply this technique of rationalizing reinterpretation to the actual setup of the state. And it's much easier to apply it to the interpretation of the allocation of rights. So this establishes a selective bias in favor of one kind of constitutional change against another. The reinterpretation of rights against institutional innovation in the structures. So that seems to be part of what happened, but go on.
I mean, what I'm thinking about is a lot of this energy that a high energy democracy would have required.
Has an escape valve on the agrarian
I mean,
frontier,
the
for
US is still
example.
a young country, and for
Yes.
most, or at least a good part of its history, the West was, you know, as indigenous people were pushed off their lands, the West was available to
Sure.
go. And there, this idea of self-construction is much more valuable,
Sure.
maybe, and all these. So how does all of that play into this?
Well, of course, it's an element, but it's an element like everything else in history is ambiguous, because you'll say, well, go west. But in the West, we'll establish a different set of arrangements, we'll experiment, and then those arrangements will become a model for the country. So they would go back. But so in going to the West, they didn't escape the inhibiting influence of these 2 constrictions that I just described, of the weakness of democracy and of the illusions of thought, the reification of the private order. So it continues to be part of the background. Yes,
So just in inverse of this great question is,
yes.
you're exalting this agrarian, in fact, institutional experimentation between people and government, but that was enabled by westward expansion and imperialism. And to what extent did that geography and physical space create the necessary conditions for institutional experimentation that we no longer have? You know,
Well, for the form of experimentation that took place. But there are many other possibilities. I mean, it doesn't seem that the existence of the agrarian frontier is the only possible condition for the continuation of these institutional experiments.
if you define it as the agrarian frontier, I agree, but there was something about the West having less developed and less developed government and
Yes.
government with less capacity.
Yeah.
We don't have those geographic spaces in the same sense anymore. So maybe the inverse argument is.
Well, but the agricultural example that I gave was not an example of government being bypassed by the farmers. The farmers were working with the government. There was this partnership. So that form of 19th century agriculture was the co-product of the government and the family scale entrepreneurs. They did it together.
The slight point I'm trying to make, building on that, is it was in a legal space with not a predefined legal arrangement that's part in terms of governing the relationship of the market and political
Sure.
economy.
So,
But
but it would take now other forms, right?
where does that exist?
Well,
now?
because it wouldn't be about agriculture, it would be about other things, like the debate that we're coming to about the new productive vanguard, the knowledge economy. So it exists only in insular and exclusive form. How could it come to exist in inclusive form? So that instead of being cabined in a series of vanguards or fringes in each part of the production system, it spreads and deepens. And that's not something that the private entrepreneurs could do alone. It's only something that they could do with the government. And then, as they did agriculture in the 19th century, and then they have to have an idea of that. And so the idea, so they've actually had very primitive ideas about that, like the governors wanting each of them to have his own Silicon Valley. So they do a little industrial park, subsidized and so forth. So that doesn't work. Of course it doesn't work. And then they come to the next idea that would be more ambitious. So in the historical experience, there are always going to be opportunities or provocations, hooks for this activity, but of course they'll have a very different form from the form that they took in the early 19th century. That's just one form. I mean, I gave you the example of finance. Finance didn't depend on the agrarian frontier, but they were also innovative in the reshaping of the capital markets. So it seems to me that's just one form of what happened. Now let's go one step further let's go forward to the middle of the 20th century. And the last great moment of institutional and ideological refoundation in the United States, which was Roosevelt's New Deal, and which now tends to be idealized or sentimentalized by the progressives. So it didn't really carry forward this relation between mobilization on top and selective democratization below. It did something else, I want to argue, much more limited, and establishes an inadequate model for what the progressives could or should do now. But let's try to understand what happened there. So let's define the New Deal as the so-called long New Deal, from Roosevelt's coming to power in 1933 to the end of the Second World War after he had already died, and then the aftermath. So you can distinguish 4 moments in this long New Deal, and each of them is immensely interesting for different reasons. So the first moment is actually quite brief. From Roosevelt's inauguration in March of 1933 to a year and a half later in the fall of 1934. That was the period of intense institutional experimentalism, which Roosevelt described himself as a radical experimentalism. Let's try many things. But actually, the main content of the institutional experimentation took a very particular form. And the form was what, in today's vocabulary, we would describe as corporatism. So the main effort in this early New Deal was not to democratize economic opportunities and capabilities. It was to restabilize the economy, and in particular to restabilize it by concerted action between big business and organized labor orchestrated by the national government. And it included a suppression of competition and the creation of a system of managed competition and guided prices. That was then combined with direct employment of part of the mass of unemployed by the national government in the form of labor fronts or work teams. Now, it is really astonishing that the detailed content of these programs of the early New Deal was very, very similar to what was done by the European regimes, including the fascist and Nazi regimes in the early years of power at that time. And of course, this is a very inconvenient truth for the Americans, very disturbing. But there's very little difference between the economic programs adopted by Roosevelt in this initial period and the ones adopted by Hitler. It's the same thing. The same corporatist arrangements, the same managed competition, the same focus on restabilization, the same appeal to labor fronts and direct employment. Now, what that demonstrates is not that Roosevelt sympathized with the fascist regimes. What that demonstrates is that in the real world, we're all hostage to the ideas that are available to us. And those were the ideas that were predominant at that historical moment. So the progressives often think that there's no problem about ideas. They'll come to power, they'll have to face the powerful interests. Those are the main obstacles. But you'll have ideas whenever you want to have them. And that's not how it works. The scarcest resource are the ideas. And you don't have them when you need them or want them, just because you need them or want them. And then you turn around and you look, you say, who are my advisors? What are the ideas? What can be done? And you're enveloped by a climate of opinion. This is this tragic element in political experience, this dependence on. So Roosevelt ends up being a stabilizer and a corporatist, not because he wanted to, but because that's the only thing that he and the people around him knew how to do. And that was the dominant set of ideas in that historical moment in the early 1930s. So many of the initiatives that were formed as devices for this corporatist restabilization of the economy were then invalidated by the Supreme Court, like the National Recovery Administration. Then begins a second moment of the New Deal, which is a narrowing funnel. The earlier corporatist institutional experimentalism is either abandoned or downsized. And the focus becomes the provision to antidotes against economic insecurity, exemplified by the Social Security program, but also by the restraints against banking. So federally insured deposits in exchange for the division that the Glass-Steagall Act imposed between deposit taking insured by the federal government and proprietary trading. You'll have two different kinds of banks. We'll have a highly regulated world for the general public, and then we'll have another world for the financial speculators and the high net worth individuals. Later on, in the early 21st century, the Americans were to see that everything that was prohibited in the regulated sector could be repackaged and done in the unregulated, in the thinly regulated sector, and that became part of the background to the financial crisis of 2008. So the institutional experimentalism of the early New Deal persisted, but in a much narrower terrain, especially in the organization of housing and of the secondary mortgage market, the creation of the governmentally sponsored enterprises, the GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, to make housing accessible to the general population. So the institutional experimentalism survived only in that corner, but the main focus became safeguards against economic insecurity. So now we have two stages of the New Deal. In the first stage, stabilization rather than democratization of the economy. Manage competition rather than the radicalization of competition. And in the second stage, economic security, but without economic empowerment. That's the real New Deal. And with a series of political compromises, such as the failure to implement both the civil rights laws or to propose civil rights laws and the labor laws in the South to have the political support of the Southern Democrats in the Congress. Now comes a remarkable episode in the history of the long New Deal, which is the war economy. Unstudied, extraordinarily interesting episode in American history. So the Americans seem to be entirely devoted to this ideology of the particular kind of market order. And it seems to be part of the national identity. Then comes the war, the greatest war in history. And the Americans cast off their economic arrangements to which they were supposedly devoted as if it was just a mask. And they then organized the economy on a completely different basis. Massive mobilization of national resources and radical institutional innovation. Now, the degree of mobilization of resources is literally incredible to the Americans who are alive now. So, for example, the level of military procurements in the first 6 months of 1942 exceeded the total GDP of the United States in 1941. And the top marginal rate of the personal income tax went over 90%. So this is radical mobilization of resources. And this was combined with a flexible partnership between the state and big business in the production of war material. The price system was entirely administered, and it's as if the market order was suspended. Now, the practical result was sensational. There's never been a similar episode of economic growth in American history. In 4 years, from 1941 to 1945, the GDP of the United States doubled twice in 4 years under this regime of radical mobilization and far-reaching institutional change. So everything that the Americans were supposedly unable to do by virtue of their culture and ideas and so forth, they did in fact, and they did with vast success in this very concentrated historical period. So the early institutional experimentalism of the New Deal is abandoned, but then retaken with a vengeance under the conditions of the war economy. Now, the war economy might have been seen as a template or a model for the subsequent reorganization of the peacetime economy, but that didn't happen. It was treated as a complete exception with no pertinence to the subsequent organization of the economic order under peace. And then the focus on economic security that characterized the second moment of the New Deal in this fourth moment became the massification of consumption. the democratization of purchasing power. And this was already presaged during the war. So someone asked Franklin Roosevelt, what book would you most like to see in the hands of every Soviet child? Thinking that he would answer the Holy Bible. But he answered the Sears Roebuck catalog. And this was then, became the fun, having abandoned an attempt to change the structure. The focus then narrows to consumption. The democratization of the economy on the demand side, never on the supply side. So we see how this has been a potent influence on everything that came afterwards. So later, in the subsequent decades in the United States, the dominant strategy of economic growth can be summarized in 2 words: cheap money. And the strategy of economic growth is not implemented by the national government. It's delegated by the national government to the central bank, the Federal Reserve. And it is then fueled by debt and credit. So the Americans replaced the ideal of a property-owning democracy with a kind of fake credit democracy, enabled, among other things, by the overvaluation of the housing stock as collateral, which is also part of the background to the crisis of 2008, and supported by the structural imbalances in the world economy. So, and especially revealed in the relations between the 2 major economies in the world, China and the United States. So the Chinese would have to deepen their internal market rather than remain restricted to export-led growth. But the deepening of the internal market is not a technical operation. It requires massive redistribution among classes, regions, and sectors in China. And this redistribution is intrinsically conflictual. And there's no way under the authoritarian system of the Chinese state to organize this conflict. It's too dangerous. So instead of deepening the internal market, the Chinese export their capital and trade surplus to the United States. The United States has ceased to produce enough goods and services that the rest of the world wants under this regime of having no strategy of economic growth other than cheap money, and replacing the dissemination of property and opportunity by the dissemination of credit and debt. And so the Americans then, instead of developing a productivist project of their own under the new conditions, import the capital and commercial surplus of the Chinese. So their capital and trade surpluses are the inverse of deficits, are the inverse of the Chinese surpluses. And each of these 2 countries uses the structural imbalances in the world economy as a way to evade the imperative of internal structural change. So that's then, this is all part of the background of reality to understand now the predicament of the progressives in the real world against this background. So the New Deal is very instructive, but it's an instructive as much in its failures and omissions as in its achievements. And it's not a model, according to this argument, for what has to come next. Because now we have the situation in which there's a new vanguard of production, a knowledge economy. It's confined to these narrow fringes in each part of the production system. that confinement becomes a cause of both the aggravation of economic inequality and the deepening of economic stagnation. And so there has to be a productivist project, a project of economic empowerment, and not simply the provision of safeguards against economic insecurity and restabilization of the economic order. And they actually haven't done anything like that since the first half of the 19th century. Now, the problem is, how could they do it again unless they somehow manage to loosen the restraints imposed by those two forces of weak democracy and misleading ideas, the reification of the existing order. All right, so that's all I wanted to say by way of historical remarks, and in a way, I intend this discussion to be an example of how we can use history, controversy about historical experience, to inform the programmatic debate. Because this is, in a way, these are all very simple things, but I think it's fair to say that when you look at these facts, they're still surprising. And their intention with the established assumptions about the country and its history. Yes?
So in reimagining these, or this rearrangement of economics, do you think that economic growth will continue to be, or must continue to be regarded as inherently desirable and kind of boundlessly possible?
Yes, so that's, of course, a long argument. But my answer to that question, my own answer, is decisively yes. So, for many different reasons. So, first, because only economic growth can lift the burden of poverty, infirmity, and drudgery weighing on human life. Second, because we know from historical experience that it is much, much easier for there to be a broadening of opportunities and capabilities, a redistribution of chances in a climate of accelerating growth than in a climate of economic stagnation, when the conflict over distributive shares intensifies. And third, because I share Karl Marx's belief that economic growth is like a storm of destruction and creation that burns everything up. And I want that, because that's the atmosphere in which we ascend by this perpetual revolution. So I regard economic growth as an ally in the continuance of this project of world revolution, as opposed to the idea that we'll simply colonize our existing forms of life and stabilize or restabilize in the way in which the early New Deal tried to do. Yes?
So in this conceptualization, building off of that point, is with the U.S.'s role in this future economic growth under this progressive system, they move away from institutional corporatism towards like ideas, knowledge economy kind of things. Is that path forward for growth?
No, well, let's postpone that to the programmatic discussion. So I think it's perfectly fair to, we all have this problem, that when we're having a discussion of criticisms or historical interpretations, everyone thinks, well, what's the alternative? But even if there were no alternatives today for us, and that proposition is, to my mind, entirely false, we would still have reason to want to see what happened as it is, as it was, and not to have some illusion about it. So now the American progressives, for the most part, have a fantasized version of the New Deal. They don't know what really happened there. And then it's a kind of false model of what has to come next. We can learn a lot from it, but to learn a lot from it, we have to understand it. And so that was the aim of this compressed argument about what happened there. And the third step of the argument then, which we don't have time for today, is then to trace the direction informed by this background of a progressive alternative that would not share in the limitations of the New Deal and that would reproduce under the contemporary circumstances that dynamic that I described of the early 19th century. So that's what I want to do next. But in these remaining minutes, let's just focus on the significance of this historical experience. Like the war economy, fantastic. And because it was like a laboratory of a series of transformations that were supposed to be impossible. But they happened. And it worked. And it had this fantastic result. And this is just the practical political economy. Now, there's a shadow with respect to the war economy of war. And this isn't just about the United States. This is about humanity. So we began the class today talking about humanity. Let's finish it talking about humanity. The Second World War was the most terrible war in human history. In the Second World War, in all of the belligerent powers, including the Soviet Union, where 22 million people died, rates of suicide and depression fell precipitously. People stopped being depressed and they stopped killing themselves when they were in this most terrible war in human history. Then, as soon as universal peace was reestablished, the rates of suicide and depression rose again to what they were before the war. Now, why is that? So it seems that we want to live for something greater than us. You know, it's like this war is like takes us out of the long littleness of life into something bigger. And then we forget about ourselves. And then when we forget about ourselves, we're happier, even though we're surrounded by slaughter. So this is something about us. And how can you have programmatic ideas about society that are not responsive to what we discover about ourselves? That it's not just about economic security or access to these material goods, but it must somehow respond to this desire that we have to be bigger and to be bigger together. And why should we need to be slaughtering one another in order to have this experience of being bigger together? So this problem, this spiritual problem, is bound up with the contest over these temporal worldly arrangements. And the kind of thing that was a vital concern to the prophets, to the American prophets, and to the other prophets. So the prophetic voice has to speak again in some form, and it has to be responsive to the historical circumstance, and it has to have institutional ideas. Were you going to say something? Yes.
So when you mentioned the war economy, and so what I think of is that during a crisis is probably the only time when solidarity gets precedence over the self. And would that not mean that all of these like changing the market order, where we look at primary distribution, which would rely on solidarity rather
Yes.
than the self, would always be short-lived and only in the moment of crisis.
Well, to be fair now to the American experience, there are remarkable demonstrations of solidarity in the United States. So there's no advanced country in the North Atlantic world that has a comparable level of private philanthropy. And not just the giving of money, but the giving of time. And but still, there's this idea of the little Napoleons crowning themselves, but they're capable of extraordinary generosity. So there are various religions in the United States that impose as an obligation something like the tithe, giving 10% of everything you earn. If, for example, the Latter-day Saints, you spend 2 years as a missionary, you give up 10% of what you earn, they all do it. And so there are these extraordinary resources of generosity. But then we have to ask, against what structural template? Walled off from the public world. So this is all part of the experience. So just take in philanthropy. I said it's not just money, it's time. Now, you might think that there was a linear relation between how few children you have and how much time you give to charity. But the empirical study shows that it's exactly the opposite. The more children you have, you supposedly have less time, the more time you give to a philanthropic activity. So the real human being is different from what seems to be this logic of the automaton.